3 days before his patent was set to be filed, Westbridge University fired Professor Malcolm Whitaker, erased his name from 12 years of research, and called his life's work a costly failure. He walked out with nothing but a single box of documents while the colleagues who owed him everything stayed silent and let it happen. What Westbridge never knew was that the invention they buried was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they had just handed it to their fiercest rival. 1 year later, that rival earned $300 million from the very technology Westbridge threw away. Then Westbridge did something even more reckless. They sued to take it back, never imagining Malcolm had kept the one thing that could destroy them. Stay until the end to watch a disgraced professor turn the evidence they tried to bury into the case that ruins them. The laboratory at Westbridge University was nearly silent at midnight, lit only by the pale glow of monitoring screens and the faint hum of cooling systems. Malcolm Whitaker stood in front of a testing chamber that held a prototype battery cell labeled BW17, a device that represented more than a decade of failure persistence and quiet obsession. His technology relied on an organic polymer membrane that allowed a battery to store far more energy charge faster and dramatically reduce the risk of fire, a combination that could change everything, from electric vehicles to hospital backup power to entire city power grids. For 12 years, Malcolm had absorbed rejection after rejection, watched funding committees dismiss his proposals, and endured department heads who quietly doubted whether a man like him belonged in a laboratory this prestigious. He never answered doubt with anger. Instead, he let the data speak for him night after night, until the data finally had something extraordinary to say. Malcolm had built his entire career on patience rather than spectacle, choosing to spend years refining a single membrane material while colleagues chased faster, flashier projects that promised quicker publications and easier praise. Every setback taught him something the previous failure had not, and he kept detailed records of each version of the polymer, numbering them carefully so that no piece of knowledge, however small, would ever be lost along the way. Grant Mercer and Tessa Monroe, two young researchers who had grown up professionally inside Malcolm's lab, were there for the test that would define everything. When the readings came back, the prototype had outperformed the best commercial battery on the market by 42%, a number so far beyond expectation that Grant read it twice before he believed it. The room erupted in a kind of disbelief that only scientists who understand the odds can truly feel. Grant was certain this discovery would carry Malcolm toward the most prestigious award in his field. Tessa immediately backed up every file to the internal storage system, unaware that this simple act of caution would later become the thread that unraveled an entire conspiracy. Malcolm only stared at the graph on the screen, calm in a way that unsettled the younger researchers around him. He told them quietly that this success did not belong to him alone, but to everyone who had ever been told they were not good enough to stand inside a room like this one. The next morning, Malcolm presented his results to Meredith Sloan, the department head who had overseen his work for years without ever fully believing in it. Instead of congratulations, Meredith questioned why he had run the test without final board approval, and she spent the meeting minimizing the results, suggesting the numbers might simply be a margin of error. Malcolm asked her to file for provisional patent protection immediately, since university policy required the Intellectual Property Office to submit preliminary paperwork within 3 days of a breakthrough like this. Meredith agreed to his face, then privately instructed the legal department to delay the filing indefinitely. She understood with the precision of someone who had spent years protecting her own position that if the patent were registered under Malcolm's name alone, his influence would grow beyond anything she could control. That threat to her authority mattered more to her than the discovery itself, and by the end of that same day, she was already building a plan to contain it. By the afternoon, Meredith walked into the office of Preston Halbrook, the university president, carrying a thick folder with Malcolm's name printed across the front page. She closed the door behind her and told him plainly that they had a problem because a professor was about to become bigger than the institution that employed him. Preston listened without interrupting, understanding immediately what she meant. Neither of them said the word threat out loud, but the meaning hung in the room regardless, and by the time Meredith left his office, the machinery of a quiet betrayal had already begun turning. Meredith and Preston soon brought Russell Vance, the chairman of the board, into their private discussions, and together they reviewed a commercial projection prepared by an outside consulting firm. The estimate was staggering, suggesting the technology could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue within its first few years alone. Preston had no intention of losing control over a discovery this valuable, but there was a serious complication buried in the fine print of Malcolm's employment contract. That contract only granted the university ownership over technology developed, using official university funding, and the core breakthrough behind BW17 had been conceived before Westbridge ever allocated a single dollar toward the project. Malcolm had also used equipment purchased through an independent research grant property that legally belonged to no one but the grant itself. In other words, Westbridge could only claim partial ownership unless Malcolm voluntarily signed away his rights, and everyone in that room understood he would never do so willingly. Meredith proposed a plan with the calm confidence of someone who had done this kind of thing before. First, they would freeze Malcolm's research budget without explanation. Then they would accuse him of violating safety protocols and misusing laboratory resources, building a paper trail designed to look damning under scrutiny. Once his career felt sufficiently threatened, they would offer him a choice, letting him keep his position only if he agreed to transfer full patent rights to the university. Russell worried the plan was reckless, but Meredith reassured him that a single professor, however brilliant, could never outmatch a university's legal department, and that confidence would prove to be the first crack in her downfall. Malcolm discovered soon after that the patent paperwork had never been filed, and when he visited the intellectual property office himself, he was told the application was being held for what they called a risk assessment. Meredith summoned him to a private meeting shortly afterward and presented a new agreement, one that named Westbridge as the sole owner of BW17, while listing Malcolm merely as a research employee. He refused to sign it without hesitation, insisting that a patent must accurately reflect the people who actually created the invention, because this was never only about money to him, but about the basic honesty that science depended on. Meredith shifted quickly into threats, warning that the university could shut down his laboratory, revoke his access to research data, and terminate his contract entirely. Malcolm still refused, and even when Grant later urged him privately to consider signing just to buy time, Malcolm answered that one wrong signature could erase 12 years of work belonging to an entire team, not just to himself. That night, the laboratory access system was suddenly locked, and Malcolm's key card stopped working without warning or explanation. Tessa quietly checked the server logs and discovered that several original data files had been moved into a folder controlled directly by Meredith's account, a discovery that chilled her more than she expected. She copied the access logs onto a personal drive before anyone could notice, acting on instinct rather than any clear plan for what she would do with the evidence. The next morning, every faculty member in the department received an urgent meeting notice. And when Malcolm walked into the auditorium, his name had already been removed from the official presentation of the BW17 project. In its place, Meredith Sloan's name appeared under the title of Creative Director, a label that made Malcolm understand in a single cold instant that they were not simply trying to control his invention, they were preparing to erase him from it completely. Westbridge opened an internal hearing, accusing Malcolm of research misconduct, a term vague enough to justify almost anything the university wanted it to mean. Meredith laid out a list of accusations designed to sound damning, without needing to be entirely true, claiming he had used chemicals outside authorized hours exceeded his laboratory budget, failed to properly report a minor thermal incident, stored research data outside official university systems, and pressured colleagues into confirming results that had never been independently verified. Presented together, the accusations painted Malcolm as a reckless scientist chasing personal ambition at the expense of safety, a portrait so far from reality that it would have been almost funny under different circumstances. Malcolm quickly realized that key documents had been selectively edited or removed entirely from the record. The thermal incident had actually been minor and properly reported at the time. The budget overage had been personally approved by Meredith through an email that mysteriously no longer existed in his university account. The requirement to store data outside the system had come directly from the independent research grant itself, a detail conveniently left out of the hearing. Grant was called as a witness, and before the hearing began, Meredith warned him privately that his research contract would not be renewed if he sided against the administration. Fear won that day, and Grant gave answers so vague and noncommittal that they were almost worse than silence itself. Tessa was also summoned, but she refused to confirm any of the accusations against Malcolm, prompting Meredith to threaten transferring her to a department with no connection to research at all. Malcolm defended himself calmly, without pleading, and without losing his composure, asking the hearing board to examine the server logs, the equipment records, and the original funding documents that would prove everything he was saying. Preston declared those requests outside the scope of the hearing, a ruling that made clear the outcome had already been decided long before anyone sat down in that room. Malcolm was terminated for what the university called a serious violation of research standards and damage to institutional integrity, and he was given exactly 1 hour to leave the campus grounds. 2 security officers stood outside his laboratory door as he packed his personal belongings into boxes, while colleagues who passed in the hallway found reasons not to meet his eyes. The walls around him still held certificates, published papers, and photographs from projects that had brought Westbridge millions of dollars in funding over the years, yet none of it belonged to him anymore. Not even the memory of it seemed to matter now. Meredith appeared one final time with a settlement agreement, offering 6 months of severance pay in exchange for Malcolm signing away his ownership of BW17 and agreeing never to sue the university. Malcolm looked at the document for a long moment, then tore it cleanly in half without saying a word. Meredith told him coldly that no respected university would ever hire a professor who had been fired for research misconduct, certain that she had just closed every door available to him. Malcolm answered simply that she could keep the room, but she could never become the person who had actually created what was inside it. When he walked out of Westbridge for the final time, he carried only a single box, and inside it sat his original research notebook, notarized design drawings from years earlier, and a confirmation letter from the independent funding body that had supported his earliest work. Tessa watched him leave from a window above, already certain that Westbridge had just made a catastrophic mistake, though at that moment, not even she understood how expensive that mistake would eventually become. In the months that followed, Malcolm's professional reputation suffered under a campaign he never saw coming. Westbridge quietly informed partner institutions that he was under investigation for ethical violations, a claim vague enough to spread doubt without inviting a direct legal challenge. Several universities canceled scheduled interviews without explanation, and donors who had once praised his work stopped returning his calls entirely. Malcolm lived off his savings and continued working out of a small rented laboratory space, refusing to let the technology he had spent 12 years perfecting simply disappear because a handful of administrators feared what it might cost. Them, personally. He believed that if BW17 could genuinely reduce energy costs and prevent dangerous fires, it did not deserve to be buried beneath someone else's greed. Attorney Wade Holloway reviewed Malcolm's documents with the careful eye of someone who had seen universities attempt this exact maneuver before. Wade discovered that Westbridge had never actually filed the patent application, and in their rush to pressure Malcolm into signing away his rights, they had waited too long and forfeited their priority claim entirely. More importantly, Malcolm's original notebook proved that the core component of the technology had been developed before the project officially belonged to Westbridge at all. Wade suggested that Malcolm file for the patent independently, as the sole inventor, rather than allow the technology to remain trapped in legal limbo indefinitely. Malcolm hesitated, since he never wanted this to become a fight over money, but Wade reminded him that inaction would only let Westbridge continue using his research and potentially license the technology under someone else's name entirely. Malcolm finally agreed, and a provisional patent application was filed quietly, without fanfare or public announcement. Not long after Dr. Laurel Bennett from Northcrest reached out to Malcolm, directly having read his older published papers and heard rumors that Westbridge had abruptly shut down a promising project. Laurel did not ask about the accusations first. Instead, she asked to see the raw data, a request that immediately told Malcolm she understood what actually mattered. He brought her his complete notebooks, physical samples, and testing results, and Northcrest assembled an independent team to reproduce his experiments from scratch, refusing to take his claims on faith alone. After 6 weeks of rigorous testing, the team confirmed that BW17 not only worked exactly as described, but performed even more consistently than Malcolm's own earlier reports had suggested. Laurel personally reviewed every stage of the verification process herself, refusing to take shortcuts, even when early results already looked promising, because she understood that a discovery this significant needed to withstand scrutiny from skeptics far more hostile than she was. Laurel then offered him a position at Northcrest built around 4 clear conditions, promising that Malcolm would be recognized as the lead inventor, retain a voice in every licensing decision subject, all data to independent audits, and Markham. Ensure the research team never concealed unfavorable results. Malcolm accepted, on the single condition that the technology never become an exclusive product, reserved only for wealthy clients able to afford it. The two sides established what they called the Whitaker Energy Storage Center, and Northcrest filed a complete patent application while inviting national laboratories to independently verify the results. The positive findings triggered immediate interest from major energy companies eager to license a technology this promising. Darren Caldwell, the director of Helios Grid, offered the very first licensing agreement valued at $80 million. And it was quickly followed by contracts with an electric vehicle manufacturer, a data center corporation, and a backup power provider. Malcolm never celebrated with lavish parties or public announcements. Instead, he returned straight to the laboratory and asked his new team to run additional durability tests on the polymer membrane, refusing to let success dull his standards even slightly. While Northcrest quietly prepared to commercialize BW17, Westbridge remained convinced that Malcolm had simply vanished from academic life altogether. Meredith, unaware of what was coming, had already begun presenting an unfinished imitation of the technology to potential investors of her own. Malcolm's patent was officially approved, and Northcrest's press release named him as the lead inventor of what they now called the Whitaker Cell, a title that spread rapidly across the energy industry within days. Helios Grid deployed the technology at 3 large-scale power storage facilities, achieving efficiency higher than projected, while maintenance costs dropped significantly below expectations. An electric vehicle company paid a substantial licensing fee to integrate the technology into a new commercial vehicle line, while 2 data center corporations signed contracts to use the system as backup power infrastructure. Within 12 months, Northcrest received $185 million in initial licensing fees, $46 million from related research contracts, $39 million in manufacturing royalties, and $30 million through strategic investments and partnerships. Combined, the direct revenue tied to this single patent reached exactly $300 million, an achievement that made headlines across the energy sector almost overnight. Northcrest used part of that revenue to expand its research facilities, establish a fund supporting overlooked scientists, and finance energy programs for hospitals and public infrastructure projects that could never have afforded the Potican technology otherwise. Malcolm received substantial royalty payments, but changed almost nothing about how he lived. What mattered most to him was simple. His name was correctly recorded on the patent, and the colleagues who had helped him were finally credited fairly for their contributions. At Westbridge, Preston Halbrook watched the news unfold on a screen during a board meeting, his expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to panic. Russell Vance grew furious upon realizing that a rival institution had just earned $300 million from a technology originally developed inside their own laboratory walls. Donors began calling for explanations, and journalists asked pointed questions about why Westbridge had fired the very man who invented one of the most significant energy breakthroughs of the year. Meredith insisted publicly that Malcolm had stolen university intellectual property and carried it directly to a competitor, a claim she repeated with growing confidence despite having no real evidence behind it. She recommended that Westbridge sue Northcrest for $500 million in damages and demand an injunction blocking further use of the patent entirely. Preston saw an opportunity to reclaim both money and reputation in a single move, and the board quickly approved the lawsuit without much debate or hesitation. Westbridge released an aggressive public statement accusing Malcolm of stealing laboratory data, violating his employment contract, transferring trade secrets to a competitor, lying about the origin of the invention, and exploiting university resources for personal profit. Reporters descended on Northcrest almost immediately, and although advisors urged Malcolm to avoid public appearances entirely, he chose instead to hold a brief press conference of his own. He did not attack Westbridge directly. He simply stated that every page in his research notebook carried a date, a witness signature, and legal notarization, proving exactly when the work had been done. Malcolm told reporters plainly that he had not brought Westbridge's technology to Northcrest, but had instead carried his own technology away from a place that had tried to erase his name from it entirely. That single sentence became a headline across multiple news outlets within hours, reframing the entire narrative almost overnight. Westbridge believed a prolonged lawsuit would eventually force Northcrest into a quiet settlement, confident that their size and legal resources would simply outlast their opponent. But Wade Holloway quietly explained to Malcolm that the lawsuit actually handed them a powerful advantage they had never expected, because for the first time, Westbridge would be legally compelled to turn over internal emails, server logs, and records of every closed-door meeting they had ever held. Those very documents, buried and forgotten, were about to expose the entire conspiracy in exact detail. The evidence discovery process began, and Westbridge was required to hand over thousands of emails, financial records, and laboratory documents to the court. Meredith instructed the technology department to release only files she considered directly relevant, a decision that immediately raised suspicion among the legal teams involved. Wade suspected large amounts of data had been deliberately withheld, and he requested that an independent digital forensics expert examine Westbridge's servers directly under court supervision. The university initially resisted, citing the need to protect confidential research, but the judge approved the request anyway, since Westbridge was the party who had chosen to accuse Malcolm of theft in the first place. The forensic review recovered a striking number of emails that had been deleted, restoring conversations everyone involved had believed were gone for good. In one email sent to Preston before Malcolm's termination, Meredith had written that if Malcolm were formally credited on the patent, he would gain far too much leverage to negotiate on his own terms. Another message proposed creating enough professional pressure to force Whitaker into signing over his rights voluntarily, language that left little room for innocent interpretation. The most damning document was a revenue projection, estimating $420 million, prepared before the termination hearing even took place. That single document proved beyond doubt that Meredith and Preston understood the enormous value of BW17, while publicly dismissing it as a costly and unworthy investment. Server logs further revealed that Meredith's account had accessed Malcolm's research folder the night before his hearing, during which several files were renamed, relocated, or deleted from his personal account entirely. Tessa Monroe decided to come forward as a witness, handing Wade the drive containing her original copy of the access logs she had secretly preserved months earlier. She explained that Meredith had once ordered her to alter dates within a laboratory report to make it appear as though Malcolm had conducted unauthorized experiments, an instruction she had flatly refused to follow. As punishment, she had been removed from the laboratory given lower performance evaluations, and passed over for a promotion she had clearly earned. Grant Mercer struggled privately with guilt over his silence during the original hearing, a weight that had only grown heavier with time. Meredith continued pressuring him afterward, demanding he sign a statement, claiming the core idea behind BW17 had actually come from her, a claim Grant knew to be completely false. He eventually met with Malcolm at Northcrest and confessed that his silence had directly helped Westbridge justify firing him in the first place. Malcolm did not scold him for it. He told Grant that fear might silence a person once, but choosing to remain silent afterward was what ultimately defined who they became. Grant agreed to testify, providing meeting recordings that clearly showed Meredith never truly understood how the polymer membrane worked, at a technical level frequently confusing basic concepts even during specialized discussions. Westbridge began losing control of the narrative entirely, and Russell Vance urged Preston to negotiate a private settlement, but Northcrest refused to consider any deal that included a confidentiality clause. Malcolm did not ask for additional money. He asked only that Westbridge publicly withdraw every accusation of misconduct, restore his professional record, apologize to the researchers who had been threatened, and publish the full results of the investigation, and remove the individuals responsible for the conspiracy from positions of authority. Preston accused Malcolm of trying to humiliate the university publicly. Malcolm answered that he was simply asking Westbridge to speak the truth with the same public visibility they had once used to destroy his reputation. Near the end of the forensic review, investigators discovered an encrypted folder labeled Project Renewal, hidden deep within Meredith's private files. Inside was a detailed plan for registering a modified version of BW-17 under her own name once Malcolm had been removed from the university entirely. This was no longer merely a contract dispute over ownership. It was clear, documented evidence of deliberate intent to steal someone else's invention. The formal hearing over patent ownership drew national attention almost immediately, with Westbridge arriving, accompanied by a large team of attorneys, prepared to argue that any work performed on campus automatically belonged to the university. Wade dismantled that argument, using Westbridge's own employment contract, which only granted ownership over inventions developed entirely through university funding and resources. He presented evidence showing the core concept had been documented 2 years before Westbridge ever provided funding, that an independent grant had purchased the primary equipment, that Malcolm had never signed any full transfer agreement, and that the university had deliberately delayed the patent, filing to apply pressure. He further showed that Malcolm had been fired only after refusing to sign away his rights, and that university leadership had attempted to register a modified version of the technology under Meredith's name shortly afterward. Meredith was called to testify, and she claimed to have provided the scientific direction behind Malcolm's work throughout the project. When Wade asked her to explain the ion-binding mechanism within the polymer membrane, her answer was vague, inconsistent, and ultimately incorrect. Wade then played a recording from an earlier internal meeting in which Meredith openly admitted she did not understand why the technology functioned as it did, and instructed Malcolm to simplify it so that management could more easily sell the concept to investors. The courtroom fell completely silent, and even the attorneys seated beside Meredith seemed to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, as though sensing the ground beneath their entire case had just given way. Tessa testified about the relocated data files, and Grant admitted under oath that he had been threatened with unemployment if he defended Malcolm during the original hearing. Meredith's own emails were displayed on the courtroom screen, including the line about creating enough professional pressure to force Whitaker into signing words that needed no further explanation. Preston attempted to shift blame entirely onto Meredith, claiming he had known nothing about the specific details of her plan. Wade responded by presenting a signed meeting record, proving otherwise, in which Preston had agreed that firing Malcolm would strip him of any real leverage to negotiate ownership rights. Russell Vance could not deny that the board had known the projected commercial value of BW-17 well before the termination hearing ever took place. Wade closed his presentation with the same box of documents Malcolm had carried out of Westbridge on the day he was fired, opening it to reveal the original research notebook inside. Every page carried a clear date, signatures from independent experts, and official confirmation from the funding organization that had supported the work from the very beginning. The most critical page described in precise detail the exact polymer structure that would later be granted a patent years afterward, and the date on that page came nearly 2 years before Westbridge ever provided funding for the project at all. Westbridge no longer had any argument left strong enough to counter what the evidence had already proven. When Malcolm was invited to speak, he told the court this case was never only about a single patent or $300 million. It was about whether a scientist had the right to be recognized for work they actually created, and whether a university was meant to protect the truth rather than let whoever held the highest position rewrite it whenever convenient. The court confirmed Malcolm as the legitimate inventor and upheld Northcrest's right to use the patent under their existing licensing agreement. Westbridge's demand for $500 million was dismissed entirely, and the judge referred the matter of falsified records and false testimony directly to the appropriate investigative authorities for further action. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Malcolm how it felt to defeat his former university. He answered simply that he had not defeated Westbridge at all. The people who had betrayed the university's own principles had done that to themselves long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. In the aftermath of the ruling, a full crisis swept through Westbridge almost immediately. Major donors suspended their contributions, and several corporate partners demanded audits of other research projects that Meredith had previously overseen. Faculty members organized a vote of no confidence against Preston Halbrook, while former students, past researchers, and scientists who had once worked at Westbridge sent formal letters demanding a complete overhaul of the university's intellectual property policies. An independent investigation later revealed that Meredith had listed her name on multiple projects she never directly contributed to, and several other researchers came forward, claiming they too had been pressured into giving up authorship, credit in exchange for funding, or continued employment. Meredith was suspended and later fired for data manipulation, retaliation against witnesses, and attempted theft of intellectual property. Preston resigned soon afterward, having concealed critical information and issued public statements he knew to be false. Russell Vance stepped down from his position as board chairman not long after. Westbridge was forced to spend tens of millions of dollars on legal fees, settlements, audits, and internal system reforms, a devastating financial blow that could easily have been avoided entirely. Insurance premiums rose sharply. Applications from prospective researchers dropped for the first time in years, and several long-standing partnerships with outside laboratories were quietly suspended, pending review, each consequence compounding the last in a slow and very public unraveling. Worse still, the university had lost any chance of holding a stake in a technology now generating $300 million in annual revenue. A financial analyst later estimated that if Westbridge had simply treated Malcolm fairly from the beginning, they could have earned more than $90 million in the very first year, alone with hundreds of millions more likely to follow in the years after that. Instead, driven by a desire to control everything, they ultimately walked away with nothing at all. The new leadership at Westbridge eventually reached out to Malcolm with an offer of reconciliation, proposing to restore his title as Professor Emeritus, name a laboratory in his honor, and provide substantial financial compensation for what had been done to him. Malcolm declined to return to a full-time position there. He had no interest in becoming a public relations symbol for an institution whose underlying systems had not yet meaningfully changed. He agreed, however, to attend one public meeting on the condition that Tessa Grant and other researchers who had faced retaliation be given the chance to speak as well. In the very auditorium where he had once been formally condemned, the interim university president delivered a public apology, officially acknowledging that Malcolm had never violated any research standards, that his termination hearing had been fundamentally unfair, that critical evidence had been deliberately hidden, that former leadership had attempted to force him to surrender his invention, and that the public statements damaging his reputation had been entirely false. His professional record was fully restored. Tessa received compensation for the retaliation she had endured, and Grant's negative performance evaluations, once used to silence him, were formally erased from his file. Malcolm stood at that podium, but he took no pleasure in watching the people who had wronged him fall from power. He told the audience that an organization could not fix itself simply by replacing a few individuals at the top. It had to fundamentally change how power was distributed and checked in the first place. He proposed that Westbridge establish an independent authorship protection board, one that would allow researchers to file grievances without going through the same department heads who might be the ones harming them. The new leadership accepted the proposal without hesitation. As Malcolm left the auditorium that day, he noticed his name had already been restored on the official records of the BW-17 project, though he did not linger there for long. His future no longer belonged to Westbridge, and everyone in that room seemed to understand exactly why. Northcrest held an opening ceremony for the newly established Whitaker Energy Storage Center, a gathering that avoided extravagance in favor of focusing entirely on the real-world results the technology had already produced. By that point, the Whitaker cell had been deployed in hospitals requiring stable backup power regions, prone to frequent outages, large-scale data centers, consuming enormous amounts of energy, electric vehicle manufacturing plants, and renewable energy storage stations across multiple states. Darren Caldwell announced that Helios Grid would expand its contract by an additional $150 million over the following 3 years, a signal of just how far the technology's reach had already grown. Malcolm requested that a portion of his royalty earnings be directed toward establishing the Whitaker Research Equity Fund, an organization dedicated to supporting mature scientists who had lost authorship credit, faced retaliation, or lacked the legal resources needed to protect their own inventions. Tessa joined Northcrest as Director of Data Governance, tasked with building a system that ensured every change made to laboratory data would be transparently recorded and impossible to quietly manipulate again. Grant was also invited to join the research team, though he worried privately that Malcolm might never fully trust him again after his earlier silence. Malcolm told him plainly that trust was not restored through apology alone, but through consistent action over time, and he gave Grant the opportunity to prove exactly that. Laurel Bennett offered Malcolm the position of Vice President of Research, but he declined the full administrative role, preferring instead to remain close to the actual science rather than retreat into management. He agreed instead to lead an independent patent ethics board, a role that let him continue protecting other researchers from experiencing what he had endured himself. 1 year after the ruling, Northcrest released a report confirming that the patent had generated more than $300 million in its first year alone, with growth continuing well beyond that initial figure. Malcolm insisted, however, that the more meaningful number was the growing count of essential facilities that had significantly reduced their risk of power failure because of this technology. When reporters asked whether he felt any gratitude toward Westbridge for indirectly leading him to Northcrest, Malcolm refused to romanticize the injustice he had lived through. What Westbridge did was wrong plainly, and without excuse, and the success that eventually followed did not somehow make that wrongdoing necessary or justified. He succeeded not because he had been treated unfairly, but in spite of it, a distinction he insisted on making clearly every time the question arose. This became the quiet, central truth beneath everything that had happened to him. A person who survives injustice owes no gratitude to those who caused it, simply because they eventually found a way to stand back up afterward. Inside the new laboratory, Malcolm looked at the very first BW-17 prototype, now preserved behind glass, sitting beside the same worn box of documents he had once carried out of Westbridge on the worst day of his career. Laurel asked him once why he still kept that old battered box so close at hand. Malcolm answered that it reminded him how small the truth can sometimes look when it stands alone against a powerful institution. But if protected long enough and carried far enough, that same small truth could eventually force an entire system to change. 3 years later, the Whitaker cell had become one of the most widely adopted energy storage platforms across multiple industries, a legacy far larger than the courtroom battle that had once defined its earliest chapter. Northcrest continued earning substantial revenue from the technology, while maintaining preferential licensing terms for hospitals, public infrastructure projects, and community energy initiatives that could not otherwise afford it. Malcolm was invited to speak at a national conference on research ethics, and on that stage, he chose not to frame his story as one of revenge or personal victory. Instead, he spoke directly about the systemic failures that had allowed Meredith and Preston to abuse their power for as long as they had, describing investigation processes controlled entirely by the very people being accused, authorship, rights left dependent on the goodwill of supervisors, data systems lacking any independent oversight, researchers, too, afraid of losing their jobs to testify honestly, and boards more concerned with revenue than with truth. He outlined the reforms that Northcrest and several other universities had since adopted in the wake of the case, noting that even Westbridge now appeared in national reports on institutional reform, having established an independent intellectual property board, formal protections for whistleblowers, and a requirement that any decision to remove an author's name undergo mandatory external review. Malcolm never returned to work at Westbridge, yet his influence had permanently reshaped the very institution that once tried to erase him. After his speech, a reporter asked what had hurt him most throughout the entire experience, whether it was the termination itself, the false accusations, or the loss of his laboratory. Malcolm answered that what hurt most was watching people who knew the truth choose silence because it felt safer than integrity. Grant stood near the back of that conference hall and heard the answer, clearly understanding it, not as an accusation directed at him personally, but as a warning meant for anyone who might one day face that same difficult choice. Tessa later handed Malcolm the newest research report, confirming that the next generation of the battery had just passed its final round of testing successfully. Malcolm studied the graph in front of him, and for a brief moment, it felt exactly like that midnight, years earlier, when BW-17 had first succeeded inside a Westbridge laboratory that no longer existed in his life. But this time, the report listed every single contributor by name, with no omissions and no exceptions. No one had been erased. No one's work had been quietly folded beneath the name of a leader who had never actually done the research themselves. The story closed back at Westbridge, inside the very hall where Malcolm had once been formally condemned. The plaque that had once credited Meredith Sloan as creative director had long since been removed from the wall. In its place hung a new plaque, simply stating that the technology preceding the Whittaker cell had been developed there by Dr. Malcolm Whittaker and his research team. Malcolm was not present to see it hung. He was back at Northcrest, already deep into work on his next invention, exactly where he wanted to be. His greatest victory was never the $300 million, nor Meredith's downfall, nor even the formal apology Westbridge eventually offered him. His greatest victory was far simpler than any of that. After everyone had tried so hard to erase his name, the world was finally forced to call the invention exactly what it had always been, his own. Westbridge once believed that power alone could rewrite history in its favor. But history did not remember the person who signed the order to fire Malcolm Whittaker. It remembered only the man who created the invention they once tried and failed to steal.